Good day, everyone. Welcome to the next installment in our midweek Bible study. This week we are going to be talking about, as you can see there on the bottom, the first epistle of Peter. I am not sure if I will be covering all of the epistles in this in the next few books. Second Peter is fairly short. Second and Third John are really short. I might just cover the high points in these next few letters. But let's look at First Peter here. Not usually a book that is quoted a lot. There are a few memory verses that come out of this, but not really a book that people go to for a lot of the more popular verses that show up on t-shirts and mugs in Christian bookstores and the like. A few things about First Peter as an introduction. First Peter takes up the theme that is kind of at the end of Hebrews, starting from about Hebrews 11, right? Talking about this journey that Christians have, the Christian walk, Christians do not consider the earth to be like their home. We are not citizens of any country here on earth. We are truly citizens of heaven, and we are looking forward to a better life, a better city, a better home that God is going to provide for us. It's very much a theme in Hebrews, and First Peter sort of takes that up. It looks at our lives here, the world that we live in, and it says, things here are not that great, and fortunately, we have a better home to look forward to in heaven. A major question in First Peter has to do with suffering and trials and trouble, and how do we stay faithful to God during these difficult times. First Peter is not very shy. It doesn't look away from the fact that the Christian life has trouble in it. Our faith does not always protect us entirely from those troubles. And an interesting thing in First Peter, it says that faith may not shield us from these things, but in fact faith may be the cause of those troubles. And how do you hold on to your faith? How do you stay faithful to God during these times when you look out into the world, you look out at your life, and you say, you know what, it is actually my belief in God that is causing me to go through these hard times. And, how do you stay faithful to God? How do you maintain that kind of devotion and any kind of excitement or, good feelings about this lifestyle that we have chosen, and the faith that we have? And so a major theme then of First Peter is to kind of give motivation to people, when our strength is kind of failing, or we're feeling discouraged, or, there's so much oppression against us, there's so many things, obstacles in our way, and faith seems to have made us into fools. What do we do then? How do we stay motivated? How do we continue to love God, love others, and live as Christians even when life gets hard? And so First Peter is saying, hey, these are reasons. We're going to motivate you to live in accordance with your principles. Live in accordance with these things that you have come to know are true, and why you should continue down this path and to live this life. A lot of things that are pretty relevant to us right now, aren't they? So let's dive into this letter. First of all, a few words on the historical background of First Peter. It starts out, the introduction says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. That's in the very first verse of this book, and towards the end of the book, in chapter 5 verse 13, it reveals where it's being written from. Peter is writing this letter from Rome. He actually calls it Babylon, And then this is a fairly common motif throughout the New Testament. The book of Revelation certainly identifies Rome as Babylon in several places. Babylon being sort of this historical enemy of Israel, the big bad who destroyed Solomon's temple, and Rome, of course, then the one who came along later and destroyed the second temple. So Peter is writing this from Rome. There is some discussion among scholars as to whether Peter actually wrote this. There's some evidence that suggests maybe it wasn't. First and Second Peter both actually are written in a very kind of elevated, educated style of Greek. And a number of people have questioned whether a previously uneducated fisherman from Galilee would be able to write in such elevated, elegant Greek. Okay, there are some other things about this letter, that have people questioning this, but a number of scholars have actually said that there's strong evidence that Peter may actually have written this, and I'll talk about some of the ramifications of that. Answering some of these questions about Peter's authorship kind of at the end. But here it is introduced as Peter, so I'll speak of the author as Peter. Now, if this is Peter, the disciple of Jesus, I put here no introduction needed and a question mark. Right? We don't need to talk about who Peter was very much, because most people will know that Peter was a very prominent member of Jesus's disciples. The most famous one, actually. He's always listed first in these lists of the disciples, pretty much universally accepted as the leader of the Christian church, sort of after Jesus departed for heaven. Peter in the Gospels is presented as one of Jesus' inner circle. Those three disciples, Peter, James, and John, were pretty much always with Jesus. There were times, that he would take only a select few, and those three were always accompanying him during those times. And Peter is always listed first in that group too. In a striking story from the Gospels, Jesus is asking, so who do you say I am? And Peter, in his characteristic style, just answers right away, like immediately, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus tells him in response that this is something that God has revealed to you, and you now are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And so it seems like Jesus was either like prophesying about something that would happen, or that Jesus chose him right there to be pretty much the leader of the early church. Peter figures in a lot of other places in the New Testament. His story runs throughout the entire narrative of the New Testament. He is super prominent in a lot of stories in Acts, and in a number of Paul's letters he talks about Peter being this leader in the church. In Galatians chapter 2, this highly autobiographical section that Paul is writing, he talks about several encounters that he had, both good and bad, with other Christian leaders, and Peter figures strongly in that in that account by Paul. First Peter is addressed then from Peter to the exiles of the dispersion, the similar language to the letter from James. And then it's not just a general letter to anybody. It's then directed to these places. Okay. Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. These 5 places, they're all provinces in what is now known as Turkey, what then was called Asia Minor. And these are all kinds of provinces or geographical areas in that area, Asia Minor. So this is addressed to people who are living there, and it's interesting that it's from Rome. Rome is fairly removed from Asia Minor. That's quite a ways. But yeah, apparently Peter had heard about these Christians, and he was writing to them. It is probably intended to be what is called a circular letter, similar to Revelation. Okay, Revelation, of course, is addressed to the 7 churches, and then you have these specific messages in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. And so what we think is that Revelation was intended to be passed around to each of these congregations. All right, and if you read those letters in order, it kind of goes in a circle. It's like a circle that you can actually walk. And so First Peter is probably similar to that. It is written to this general geographical location, and it's intended to be received by one group, and then they pass it on to the next, to the next, to the next. We're not sure how many churches were in these 5 areas. In fact, we don't really know a lot about a number of these places. Galatia, of course, is mentioned. It's the destination of Paul's letter to the Galatians, and Asia is kind of the area where Ephesus is located. And so we know some about those places, and we know that there are Christians, in those areas. But we hardly know anything at all, if anything, about Pontus, Cappadocia, and Bithynia. There is a section in Paul's letters or maybe in Acts, I've completely forgotten now, but it says that Paul wanted to go there, but he wasn't permitted. Like, the Spirit didn't permit him to go. So yeah, we don't know a lot about these other places. We don't know anything about the churches there, but apparently there were Christians there. The gospel had been spread to those places by the time that First Peter was written. On that note, First Peter, if it was actually written by Peter, and as I mentioned before, there is some discussion and some controversy about that, whether Peter actually wrote it. But if he did, it would have been probably in the mid-60s or so. Church tradition, and it's a pretty strong church tradition, suggests that Peter was killed in the persecution under the Emperor Nero. And Nero's persecution happened mid to late 60s. We're thinking maybe around 64 to 68, 69. And so, yeah, if this is the persecution where Peter lost his life, of course, then this letter would have had to have been written before then. Interestingly enough, in case you haven't heard this, that tradition about Peter's death says that he was crucified. He suffered the same death that Jesus did. But depending on what source you look at, it's said that Peter actually told the executioners to crucify him upside down. So he was not just crucified, but he was crucified upside down because he said he wasn't worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. And so, yeah, that is how Peter died according to tradition, and it happened under the Emperor Nero. So, yeah, that's some about the historical background of First Peter. Now, something about the audience. Okay, exactly who this is being written to is unclear. When the introduction there says the exiles of the dispersion, that certainly suggests a Jewish audience. And again, yeah, this sounds exactly like the introduction to James. And James seems to be written to either Jewish people or people who know an awful lot about Jewish customs and Jewish thinking. And so, yeah, we read this and, hey, exiles of the dispersion, that means that the audience is Jewish. But there are a number of clues in 1 Peter that say probably not a Jewish audience, actually. There are a number of references to the audience's lives, talking about how they previously, were doing all of these things, living life in this really um, you know, displeasing manner to God. Referring to their former lives, and talks about how previously you were not the people of God, you were not God's people, and you didn't know God. And so these two things have led people to think that this was not a Jewish audience. Those are very strange ways to talk about a Jewish audience. Jews, of course, were God's people, and Peter was one of them. And so, why would he be talking about Jews this way? It's probably written to an audience that was largely composed of Gentiles, Gentiles who became Christians and who now were, allowed to or empowered to identify themselves with God's chosen people. And Peter, of course, here uses kind of the metaphor of this new Israel. An interesting thing is that if this was written to, the people that are mentioned, okay, these 5 provinces in Asia Minor, we do have records of persecution happening in those areas, but not around the time that this would have been written, if this was written, in fact, by Peter. Okay, there was no widespread persecution in those areas in the mid-60s. That hadn't happened yet. The persecution that took Peter's life was mainly around Rome. Asia Minor, you had persecution flaring up later on. There was an emperor named Domitian who lived towards the end of the century, who took a dislike to Christians and initiated some persecutions. And then a couple hundred years later, there was, some more persecution around these areas. And so we think that this may not have been an actual, systematic persecution led by the officials. It may have been some kind of local problems like you read about in Revelation. Again, I'll reference Revelation because Revelation talks about, Asia Minor a lot. But in those letters, the 7 letters to the 7 churches, you see a couple of them are going through very hard times, and the author of Revelation talks about suffering and persecution a lot. But then some of these other churches, which weren't that far away, you don't have any talk about that, and in fact, some of these churches seem to be doing really well. They're described as being wealthy or enjoying a lot of privilege and such. And so, it's likely that you had this localized persecution that would flare up. Maybe in a certain city, people would take a dislike to Christians and they'd be driven out or they'd be ostracized. And so, the extensive talk about suffering in 1 Peter is probably talking about that, and not this sort of universal persecution that's happening all throughout the empire to Christians everywhere. Let's talk about themes of 1 Peter. First of all, scholars have noted something about 1 Peter, and it's something that's very interesting. A lot of the New Testament, it was written by somebody, and shows a definite sort of agenda or a way of thinking about God and the church. Certainly, Paul has a really distinctive way of thinking about these things, and Paul is not afraid to make some very controversial, some statements that are sort of his own. And he even says this, right? He'll take a parenthesis in his argument, and he'll say something like, this is coming from me and not from the Lord. Right? So that is something that's characteristic of a lot of New Testament works. You can definitely see like a Johannine style with the Gospel of John and the letters of John. You can see Pauline style with Paul's letters. You can see James has a certain way of looking at things. And of course James takes kind of an opposite approach to what Paul says. Something that's interesting about 1 Peter is that it almost seems to be going out of its way to be kind of really middle of the road, okay, and kind of mainstream. right? Very sort of a generic description of Christian belief and practice. Um, this was, apparently written by a Christian leader who did not want to really ruffle a lot of feathers, but was, focused on just ministering to and reaching as many people as he could. And so this seems to be speaking to a sort of mainstream tradition that is going to be drawing on, referencing, and speaking to as many of these sort of separate communities and separate Christianities as possible. And so we see influences from the Gospels. We see, influences from James and that sort of thinking, and then Paul's letters. In fact, it's been said that just about every verse in First Peter has a parallel passage in the New Testament someplace, whether that be from Hebrews or James or the Gospels, Luke, Acts. Okay, you can find like another passage in the New Testament that talks about every single thing that is discussed in First Peter. Okay, so he really seems to be taking this like shotgun approach to teaching and just drawing from everything, or sort of trying to influence everything and everyone. And so it's a really interesting look into the early church and sort of what they believed. In a lot of these New Testament writings, you get this very kind of localized flavor, or one person's idea in the letters of Paul. Whereas in First Peter, it really seems to be aimed at the whole church, and we get, sort of maybe what kind of the average Christian believed at this time. Just a regular everyday person who may have had access to, a few Christian letters, a few Christian works, maybe a few stories of Jesus, and First Peter is talking to them. It also includes these elements of worship. You have hymns, you have liturgical elements, you have even like maybe an early creed. It references these common styles of argument, persuasion, rhetoric, the things that would have been popular during the time, and we've seen it, right? We've seen the way that Paul uses words and rhetoric. We saw how James used it, referring back to the wisdom tradition. And so First Peter is, again, kind of taking little bits and pieces of all of these different traditions and styles and combining it into this work. Like a number of these general letters, Hebrews, James, and then the letters of John, First Peter seems to be more like a kind of book tract, okay, like a statement of belief rather than an actual letter. Okay, might even be considered like a sermon. Okay, and so these are some things to look at and to take note of when we're looking at First Peter. Now let's get into some of the specific themes. First and foremost, the most obvious thing in First Peter is this theme of suffering, and really not just suffering, but suffering for Christ. As I said at the very beginning, what do we do when we have trouble, when we're persecuted, when when you're suffering things in this world, and you think like, well, where is God in this? Why am I going through this? And in fact, like, why is my faith, why is my witness for Jesus causing me to have this suffering and these problems? When we're looking at the suffering mentioned in 1 Peter, it doesn't seem to be referencing like physical persecution. This is not Paul getting dragged through the city and getting beaten with whips or being thrown in prison. The references in 1 Peter seem to be much more tilted towards like verbal abuse, social ostracism, those kinds of things. Maybe getting your business boycotted by customers in the city or something. Christians are maligned as evildoers in chapter 2, verse 12. And then Peter talks about what to do, when we're being reviled for the name of Christ in chapter 4. And so, those are both things, like, yeah, verbal abuse, slander, these kinds of things, rather than like, yeah, getting thrown into prison and getting beaten or tortured or killed or something. But even though this is not, maybe a life and death kind of a thing, at least in an immediate sense, just remember that honor and shame, these were concepts that were major pillars of Roman society. This is pretty much the entire way that social transactions were carried out. And you wanted to do as much as you could to get things that brought you honor. And on the other side, you want to really avoid things that bring shame. Okay, and the way that you do that is kind of just live a good, quiet life. You respect the emperor, you respect the laws of the land, and you live this good life, and you try and bring honor to your family, and don't do anything that sticks out and makes people look at you and point their finger. Well, this is like how everything worked in Roman society. And if somebody started to accumulate a lot of the shame element, yeah, your life was going to be really hard, and people would not want to be around you. People would not want to, help you out. People wouldn't want to buy from your business if you had one. And so, yeah, this was serious business. We can say, that, hey, at least you're not getting killed. At least you're not getting like your head cut off, or you're not getting beaten, by whips by like some prison guard. Yes, that's true. And yeah, let's take what we can get. But really, getting too much, accumulating too much of the shame part and getting slandered and abused, it could still be a death sentence. I mean, people were living kind of hand to mouth right now, and if people stop buying from your leather store, what are you going to do? Okay, and so, yeah, these were serious things that were facing some Christians. And why was this? What was prompting, this abuse and suffering? Well, Peter does mention, okay, that, in the past you used to do all of these things, and you used to act in this kind of degenerate way that now you shouldn't be acting. But the people around you, they're still doing those things, and that's what they enjoy doing. Okay, and it's probably, things like worshiping the emperor, or, sacrificing food to idols, participating in festivals, pagan festivals, and rituals and things. And, when you do this, maybe you're getting around with the boys and drinking, or getting together with the ladies and, having a good time. And now that you've become Christians, you're not doing those things anymore, because we can't eat food sacrificed to idols. We don't want to, be getting drunk all the time. And so people are taking note of this and saying, wait a second, you used to be cool. You used to be one of us. And now what's going on? And, when they find out maybe that, hey, I've discovered this person, Jesus, and I'm trying to live my life for him now, and Jesus is Lord, and people are like, ooh, wait a second, Emperor is Lord, what are you talking about? And so, yeah, as the lifestyle changes, by the allegiance to Christianity and following Jesus, the neighbors start kind of looking at you a little bit strangely. And in chapter 4, it actually openly says, that, yeah, your former lives, now people are looking at you, and they're starting to think that you're kind of strange, you're fanatics, you don't belong here. So yeah, this is probably what is prompting some of this. And those kinds of feelings among neighbors and patrons and customers are causing these problems. Okay? And that's something that Paul references as well. It's something that is hinted at in Revelation. And so, yeah, we think this may be what's behind this. So when this happens, what do we do? What do we do as Christians? And Peter gives some counsel on this. Okay? Peter refers to the fact that Jesus predicted this would happen. Peter says that suffering is something that's happening to all Christians, and you should kind of expect it when you follow Jesus, because Jesus even talked about it. Okay? And Peter, the disciple, was there for a number of Jesus's talks about this. Right? In First Peter, there is this thing that has become kind of orthodox Christian thinking for a really long time. And it's sort of, the first answer that Christians will give about, the problem of suffering, the problem of evil in the world. Why does this happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? Well, on the one hand, suffering, yes, God is responsible in some ways for suffering because it's allowed by God. God is all-powerful, right? And, if something happens, it's because God is either causing it to happen or allowing it to happen. But then Peter turns around to the other side and says, well, no, suffering is not caused by God. It might be allowed by God, but it's not caused by God. God is not saying, okay, you need to suffer. Instead, suffering is caused, by the presence of evil in the world and the fact that people are serving evil things, and also that there's this devil, there's this person, the devil, who's running around causing trouble. And, it's from First Peter that we get this image of the devil as this roaring lion, seeking people who he can devour, and so, yeah, there's this malevolent entity that's going through the universe and causing suffering to people who belong to God. Okay, so that is kind of why suffering. Well, there's your answer, okay, because, the devil is doing this because evil people serve the devil. And God, for whatever reason, allows us to go through this. Now, even though God is allowing this, we shouldn't think that we are alone or that God wants us to suffer. First Peter affirms that God cares for those who are suffering. Right? Famous passage in First Peter. Cast all your cares upon him because he cares for you. So yeah, affirming that, no, God cares for you. God is watching over you even when you're suffering. First Peter encourages people that, your suffering is limited in time. It's not going to be forever. It's only for a short time. And one of the reasons we know that is because we believe that, in fact, the time of the end is near. We're living in, the end times, and so this is not going to be something that is, unbearable. This is something that's happening for a limited period. Now, throughout the letter, those who endure suffering are counted as blessed, and this is something that goes throughout the entire letter of First Peter. Okay, you can get that through a whole bunch of text in this letter, and if you read through it, and I really encourage everyone to do so, you'll see that theme coming up over and over again. Okay, that, yeah, you're suffering now and it's really hard, but you are blessed for a number of reasons. Now, what are some of those things? How do we deal with this? Why is suffering a blessing? Yeah, first of all, First Peter says suffering is this refining of faith. It uses this image of like refining metal in a fire. Okay, and so it's like a test of faith. It's strengthening your faith when you're suffering. Presents Jesus as one who suffered, and talks about the sufferings of Jesus. And therefore, if we're followers of Jesus, if Jesus suffered when he was on the earth, then Christians are probably predictably going to be sharing in the sufferings of Christ. And so this is another way that suffering can be a blessing. Or maybe I shouldn't say it that way. Maybe I should say those who suffer are blessed. Why don't we say that? It's not like, bad things are a blessing, but when we go through these things, we are blessed. Because we're sharing in the experience of Christ. It's getting us closer to Jesus, and it's giving us assurance that we are following in Christ's footsteps. We're following the example of Christ. When we are suffering, Peter says, we should do it like Christ did. Use Christ as our example and our model. Not returning abuse for abuse, but it says that Jesus trusted in God who restores and is just, and so we should do that too. We should believe that when we're suffering, when people treat us unfairly, that God is the one who judges, and we will ultimately be vindicated and judged as righteous by God. And so this is another way of looking at your suffering. Look forward to God making things right, and holding on to that faith that this will come, something good will come of this. And you can even, Peter says, by your witness and by your example, you may even be able to convert the people who are mistreating you, because they see that you have this conviction in a higher level of justice. You don't have to strike back. You don't have to hurt people who hurt you. And in fact, that witness, because you're witnessing like Christ did, that witness can actually convert people and bring them into the church. Now, for people who are suffering, if you can't find any silver lining in the suffering, Peter says, remember that you don't have to go through this alone. All right, and especially for people who are going through this and they're getting thrown out of their communities or their families, or people are just looking at you like you're going crazy or you're some kind of weird fanatic. Remember that the church is a family. This is one of the places it talks about the church as a substitute family. Very strong emphasis on community. And this is something that's true both locally in your own place and your own local church, but also Peter talks about Christians being a community and a family throughout the world. You have siblings, you have brothers and sisters everywhere that you go, because wherever the church is, that's where your family is. Peter then says, when you're suffering, when you're living through this, just live in such a way that shows that the people who are slandering you are, they're slandering you like it's not true. Okay, these things are false, and you're not some sort of crazy fanatic who's the cheese is just totally slid off of your cracker, and now you're living in this totally bizarre way. Show that you're still living in a sober, righteous way, that we're still good citizens of this earth, even though we're looking forward to heaven. But we want to treat people fairly, we want to do justly, and by this we show that our faith is genuine, and that we're actually believing in something that's good and not something that is wrong or strange. So yeah, there you have this very moderate middle of the road response, right? Kind of just be patient, bear up under it. Things will work out in the end. Another very strong theme in 1 Peter is the church as this kind of new Israel. Very famous memory verse in 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9. Okay, you are now a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. Powerful affirmations of people, especially if these are Christians who are losing their old communities, their old foundations, and Peter comes along and tells them this. Now we're feeling pretty good about this, right? In fact, not only are we, this new Israel, but individual Christians are building up a new temple, a new sanctuary, a new house for God. And this house is built by living stones. Each one of you, think of yourselves as living stones that are building up the temple or the house of God. Okay, and so yeah, you have a place. You have a place in this community. The church is not only like a gathering of believers, but it is really like the holy space on this earth. Wherever Christians are gathered, it's like a temple is there. Okay, and everything, worship, sacrifices, all that stuff that happened at the temple is happening here now because you are Israel, whether you're Gentiles, whether you're Jews, wherever you come from. Peter says that Jewish scriptures, okay, the Jewish prophets, the writers of Scripture, were actually inspired by the Spirit of Christ. And the things that they wrote were not just for their time, but actually for the benefit of believers in Christ at Peter's time. Okay, kind of now. Jesus was anticipating this. Jesus knew you, and he inspired these prophets who were writing Scripture to write things that would encourage us and benefit us whenever we need them. So yeah, another very powerful response to suffering. Jesus knows you. Jesus knew you from the beginning, and hundreds of years ago, when these prophets were writing their great prophecies, they were writing for your benefit. Wow. Okay. Something that is an unfortunate element to this, and this is something that I've talked about before in some of Paul's letters. People have taken this and sort of interpreted it almost in bad faith, okay, and they've said, not only has God chosen us, and we're like a new Israel, but also, God rejected the actual Jews, okay, and then of course over time in history, people have used this as an excuse to go and beat on Jews, or up to driving them out of places and murdering them, sometimes in very, very large numbers. And one of the justifications for this is that the Jews rejected Jesus, therefore God rejected the Jews, and so now Christ's body on earth can go and retaliate, which is a very strange way of looking at it, right? If you read anything that Jesus wrote or Jesus said, and was written about him, retaliation against his enemies was not something that Jesus would have signed off on. Paul speaks a lot about how God has still chosen Israel, and God still has a place in his heart and his plan for the Jews. And so using this to further, the cause of anti-Semitism, or what is called supersessionism. I think I've talked about this before, but this is sort of this belief among some Christians that the church, now Christians, have taken over the mantle from Israel, and now, God has moved all of God's blessings from Israel now to the church, and so, oh, sorry, Jews, you're all out of luck. That is a belief that's unfortunately widely held among Christians, and that I think we should be careful about. Okay? Because first of all, it is not, as I said before, it's not very Christ-like, but also there are definitely parts of the New Testament that argue directly against this. Okay, and have said that no, God has not totally rejected his people. God still has a plan for his people, and he still has a place in his heart. So yeah, we should probably take on those same kinds of attitudes towards Jewish people. Now, another thing that First Peter talks about a lot, and is pretty distinctive about this, is the relationship with earthly authorities specifically. There's this section of First Peter here, chapter 2 through chapter 3. It's called a household code, and it's one of these things that addresses a number of different people, and we'll talk about husbands do this, wives do this, slaves do this, children do this, okay, and there's a number of these in a number of these New Testament books. I've listed some of them here. Okay, Ephesians has some of these, Colossians, 1 Timothy has some extensive ones, and Titus. Well, First Peter contains a fairly long passage like this, and in there it emphasizes that we should, live in submission to earthly authorities. Um, First Peter actually comes right out and says, like, you should honor the emperor, which is an interesting point of view from, the New Testament. Uh, this section seems to be really interested and addressed to those who have less power, okay, less privilege, less position, especially wives to husbands and then slaves to masters. Um, some people have expressed a lot of disappointment with this book, okay, because, it seems to emphasize that people who are occupying kind of these positions that are lesser in society, you shouldn't make a ruckus about it. You should respect those who are like your superiors, and don't seek to rock the boat. Don't seek to have all of this social change. And people have said, like, this is just like supporting the status quo, and it's quite disappointing, particularly when you look at some statements of Jesus, some things that Paul has said, some parts of Revelation. But, we have to look at this from maybe Peter's perspective, okay? And again, Peter talks a lot about how when you suffer, when you go through bad experiences and difficult things, it is kind of following in the footsteps of Christ. You're emulating Christ. And so possibly this is saying that those who are occupying these positions that are less, these subservient positions, if you are going through difficult things because of that, you are actually emulating Christ the most. And then telling other Christians then, when you look at people in these positions, don't like abuse them or look down on them, because in fact they're actually emulating Christ the most. And in another part of First Peter in chapter 5, it says that in fact all Christians should seek to humble themselves, humble yourselves before God. So this is something that is quite distinctive to First Peter. But note that this is one perspective in Scripture, and a lot of times we as Christians, when, especially now, we're not persecuted, right? Most people who are like occupying political office in this country are Christians, at least in name. It's almost impossible to get elected to any high office if you don't come from a Christian background, or you don't say that you're a Christian. And so Christians have, I think, been tempted to kind of use these verses almost as like cudgels against people and say, hey, you need to honor the authorities, and you need to live respect with to authority and the system. Okay, don't rock the boat. And that's really something from First Peter. But we need to be careful with that, okay, because this is one perspective, this is one voice, but there are others that are very different. Okay, Paul himself, has this almost argument with himself, where in, what is it, the end of Romans 13, he's saying, really, live in peace with the authorities, because, they wield the sword, and God has given it to them, and God places them in power for reasons. But then, and look at Paul's life. I mean, he's this revolutionary figure, and he's always running afoul of the authorities. Revelation is probably one of the most anti-imperial texts that may have ever been written, okay, and just portrays, Rome and the empire and any kind of imperial power as just completely opposed to God, just completely evil and debased and just horrible, and that it is going to fall, and God is opposing it. And so, yeah, you have all of these different kind of voices and kind of clashing. And, what do we say about that? Is the Bible arguing against itself? Well, no, these are different ways of approaching this problem, right? How do we live as responsible citizens of, wherever we're living on earth, but also remembering that our ultimate allegiance is to God. And First Peter is trying to be, I think, very general here, and not speaking to any kind of local condition. And so therefore, Peter comes out and says, in general, this is a good way to live. And, if you want to have a chance at converting other people, if you want to have a chance to live like a good long life and be a witness for Jesus, live in this way and live quietly, keep your head down. Certainly remember that you're following Jesus. And, if you start suffering, if you start taking fire from people, think of it in this way. But do your best, to portray Christianity as something that is good and something that's virtuous. In other places, for example, Revelation, this is written to a certain locale at a certain time, and John the Revelator says, pretty much, you need to stand firm, you need to fight against this power, and you need to resist. And so that was the right thing to do in that situation. Whereas Peter is kind of writing to a general population and saying, yeah, as a general idea, this is a good way to live. At least that's how I see it anyway, okay? I am certainly someone who says when it comes time, we need to be ready to resist, and we need to remember that Jesus is Lord, and that means nobody else is. But I can also see where Peter is coming from, and that this is good advice. Okay, so in conclusion, some things about, if this was written by Peter, and I kind of like to think that it is. I can't say for sure that it was. We don't have anything except, that it's introduced as Peter writing it. But if you look at 1 Peter, and you look at the Peter of the Gospels, it's this really interesting contrast, right? Peter in the Gospels, he's the first to speak up. He pretty much declares that, I'm gonna be the best at following Jesus. Lord, I would die for you, and then he promptly goes out and he completely falls on his face, right? There's this episode where he goes walking out on the water, and he starts looking around, he starts sinking, and he screams out for Jesus, help me. He says hey, I'll die for you, Jesus. Nobody is going to take you away from me. And then he's the one who denies 3 times. And he's cussing people out, and yelling, I don't know the guy. I don't know the guy. Okay. So yeah, the Peter of the Gospels, he's impetuous. He's really passionate, overconfident to the point of being proud, which leads to a fall. In 1 Peter, we get the words, the advice from someone who is still confident, certainly, but this quiet, confident leader. Okay? Someone who is very even-keeled, a moderate perspective, a sort of very generalist perspective, urging patience and endurance and suffering, live a good, quiet life, where possible, live in peace with authorities, live in peace with your neighbors, and just be patient and focused and positive even when things are not going well for you. It is this, very, quiet, leader-like, presence there. Peter is focused, on growing new believers, building up the church. You get this very strong kind of sympathy, empathy even, for people who are suffering, totally in contrast to, the Peter of the Gospels. Just rushing forward, speaking first. But now this one is, Peter in 1 Peter, is kind of introspective, patient, watch how things are going before you act. Really, I've put here, you could read 1 Peter as advice that the Peter of the Gospels needed to hear. But it just shows like how much someone can grow when they have a lifetime with Jesus. Okay, we think that Jesus lived early 30s, and First Peter was written maybe in the early to mid 60s. Okay? So you're talking about like 30 years, and look how much Peter has changed and grown in 30 years, right? Look at what kind of a leader he has grown into, a leader who dispenses wise advice, constantly pointing to Jesus as the example. It's quite an inspiring thing to think that Peter could have grown as much, changed as much, and what the gospel can do for someone. Peter had this amazing experience walking with Jesus, learning from Jesus, but then that wasn't where his education stopped, right? That wasn't where his experience with Jesus stopped. It continued even after Jesus went to heaven, and Peter continued to grow and change and lead the church. And I think it's a great testimony to all of us, that whatever our experience with Christ, there's always more there, and Jesus can change us, Jesus can help us, and we will become the people that God needs when we stay with Jesus. Okay. So that's First Peter, and I really recommend this. This is good practical advice for all Christians, especially those of us who, like now, we're living in some really wild and difficult times. And if you're feeling like, you're suffering, if you're feeling like things are hard, First Peter gives some really good encouragement and some very practical advice for how to live in this world, but also remember where our true allegiance, our true citizenship, our true destination is. Okay. All right. Join us if you can for our worship service, and come back again for the next one of these Bible studies if you're able. Okay. We'll see you again. Bye.